question, am I enough, stems from the impacts of trauma. Thank you so much for joining us at the Compassionate Couch. My name is Majita Adiola Ngwayera. Trauma to me is an emotional or long-lasting emotional response that one has and sees themselves, or one tends to see themselves as inadequate. Trauma to me is what makes us doubt the value of our own existence. That is what I view as trauma. Trauma is not what happens to you, but it is a response of what happens to you. How you respond to the particular situation and at hand. What happens inside you after you have experienced a traumatic event. After you have experienced a car accident, more times than not, you decide to avoid the route where you had your accident. Sometimes you avoid being in cars. That's why we have so many people who have claustrophobia, right? This can be results of trauma. We have post-traumatic stress disorders coming in. This is a result of trauma. This is what happens inside of you after an external event has happened to you. Trauma can also come from a point where your needs as a person are not met. You're looking at it from a perspective where you're saying there is something that is supposed to happen to you in your biological time frame from conception to adulthood. Why am I saying that there is that biological time frame? Usually, more times than not, we realize that as children, we believed in ourselves so much. We were superheroes. We were super people. We used to tell ourselves, when I grow up, I want to be a pilot. When I grow up, I want to be a doctor. But because of the trauma of the experiences, school can be traumatic in itself, because once you have failed school once or twice, sometimes you think to yourself, do I still need to go back to school? Is it necessary for me to do that? That is a response to trauma. Trauma is anything that incites usually a negative response from this perspective where we're coming from. But we want to then say, how can we change the impacts of trauma from a negative perspective to then say, what has happened to me? This has already happened to me. How then do I move from the negative perspective to the positive point of view? Trauma is that which does not happen to you. Means if you're looking at your biological timeline and you're looking at your biological span, if by now I am supposed to be married, that's already a traumatic experience in itself. If someone has gone through, they're expecting that they're going to be in a marriage, but then they unfortunately had a baby out of wedlock, that in itself can be considered as trauma. That's when you notice that there's so many toxic behaviors that then come out of those traumatic experiences that we then have. The other point that then also comes in is how people respond to your distressing situation or to your traumatic situation. More times we realize that people expect you to start your life from the point of trauma. I will give myself as an example. I realize that people want me to start my story from the time when I lost my husband, when I got divorced. That's the point where they want me to start from. That is not your story. That is you just trying to identify with the trauma, to make the trauma your own. Usually love to say, this is what has happened to me. This is an external event. Use it to then grow yourself from that perspective. If you go into the Bible, I love to give an example where we say, the Bible gives us the Lord's Prayer, which says, give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. So more times than not, we realize that we look at this particular phrase from a perspective of forgiving other people, but we forget the point where we are saying a trespasser can be an event. A trespasser can also be someone. You can also trespass on yourself. You tell yourself, if I hadn't been in this place, I wouldn't have done this. If I hadn't gone, usually trauma can come from a perspective of rape. If I hadn't walked at night, this person wouldn't come to me. If I hadn't gone and visited my uncle, he wouldn't have raped me. Those are traumatic events, and usually because you want to identify with the trauma and you want to put yourself in a point where you're saying, this is how I can live better, you then tend to use negative methods of coping, negative coping mechanisms. That's how you then cope. So usually, I love to remind people that your story does not start where the trauma or your major traumatic event starts. Your story starts at the end, at the beginning. You need to remember that who were you before the trauma came? Usually we feel that after the trauma has come, you have lost your innocence, you have lost the ability to love, you have lost the ability to do something, right? Whatever it is that you thought to yourself you used to be able to do. After that trauma has come, after that trauma has clouded you and clouded your judgment, why did I bring in the aspect of the Lord's Prayer? The aspect of the Lord's Prayer then comes and tells us that forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Those who trespass against us can also be yourself. The moment you let trauma, the moment you let negative situations take control over your life, you are allowing yourself to have two gods. That trauma is already controlling you. But how then do you remove yourself from the control of the trauma? The first thing that you need to do is to realize that you were a person before the trauma actually hit you. That is the first point. You need to go back in time. You need to relive the person that you were, not the perfect self, but there's no way that we can be perfect, but when you were in your perfect state, in your perfectness, before all the trauma that happened in your span from childhood to adulthood. You need to go back in time at the particular point where you lost your innocence. And you need to be able to realize that your inner child, your inner self has not been lost to the trauma. You need to realize that you do not have or you do not need to personalize the moment. You do not need to personalize the trauma to make it your own. It is something that has already happened. It is something that has already passed. You need to be able to draw points from that particular situation. Why did I bring about the aspect of daily bread? The aspect of daily bread then tells you that when you're moving, God gives us what is enough. So when you're praying for your daily bread, the bread is not in equal proportions each and every day. You have different proportions of bread. The day you do not know which traumas they're going to go through. So you need enough bread to be able to handle the trauma that comes in your day that time. God already knows that the trauma will be there, but usually we want to relate with the trauma. We want to make the trauma our own. One thing that also comes into perspective is you need to start small. When it comes to trauma, I can't just come and say, you need to do this and you expect to change. Small, steady steps. One thing that can actually help you, for example, you're moving on the road, someone cuts in front of you and you're driving, it gets you so mad, it gets you so angry. How you need to choose to forgive those people. Small, steady steps of forgiveness lead to bigger steps of forgiveness. And this is what then will help you to build the stepping stones to remove the impacts that trauma has on you. These are small, steady steps that will help you to realize who you were, who Christ wants you to be. I love the Lord's Prayer because it says, let your will be done. If you're living in trauma, there is no will that will be done that belongs to the Lord. You are living within the will of the trauma. You are living within the barriers that the trauma has set in your life. And you need to be able to forgive yourself. There are times that the trauma, yes, you are the one who have put yourself in that particular situation, but you need to be able to forgive yourself. You need to be able to tell yourself that this has happened. I have done wrong, but because of Christ's amazing grace, He has forgiven us of all our sins. After He's forgiven us of all our sins, we need to be able to forgive ourselves as well. These are the impacts of trauma. These are some of the few solutions that you can have to manage these impacts that trauma has on your life. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Compassionate Couch. Don't forget to join us every Tuesday at 12 o'clock on all Harare City Center Church platforms. Thank you so much for joining us today. Goodbye.